The house still smelled like him. That particular mixture of old wood motor oil and the faint ghost of pipe tobacco he had given up 15 years ago, but whose memory clung stubbornly to every curtain and corner. The Calloway family home had absorbed decades of a man's life into its walls, and on the afternoon they buried Richard Calloway, it seemed to breathe those memories back out quietly, like a held exhale finally released. The funeral had been modest. Richard had asked for that, in writing. No flowers except wildflowers, no long eulogies, no catered reception. Just family, a simple wooden casket, and the cold November ground of the cemetery where his wife Eleanor had been laid to rest 7 years before. The siblings had honored those wishes, though not one of them had done it without grinding their teeth at least once during the planning. That was the Calloway way. You endured. You performed. You held your grief in one hand and your resentment in the other, and you smiled tightly at the priest. Now they were back inside the house. 12 people in a room built for 8 coats, still on coffee going cold on the kitchen counter no one had touched, and the family attorney, a patient man named Gerald Marsh, who had worked with Richard for over 2 decades, sat in the wingback chair by the window with a leather briefcase balanced on his knees. Everyone was waiting, but not for the will. They were watching the door. She arrived the way she always did in their imaginations, quietly, without announcement, without apology. Margaret Calloway, the eldest of Richard's 4 children, stepped through the front door at 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, wearing a dark gray coat and carrying nothing but her car keys. Her hair had gone silver at the temples. Her face was calm in the particular way that exhausted people learn to keep it calm, not peaceful, but controlled. The kind of stillness that costs something. She was 51 years old. She had not been inside this house in 18 years. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, the second oldest, Daniel, 47, broad-shouldered and red-faced from the cold, or from something older than the cold, pushed himself up from the armchair by the fireplace. "What are you doing here?" Margaret did not answer immediately. She did not look at Daniel or at any of them specifically. Her eyes moved across the room the way a person's eyes move when they are counting something, measuring something, cataloging what has changed and what has stayed the same. The bookshelf against the east wall, the framed photograph of their mother above the mantel, the small brass lamp their father had bought at an auction in the year Margaret was born. Then she crossed the room, not toward Daniel, not toward Gerald Marsh with his briefcase. She walked directly to the old oak bookshelf, reached underneath the 3rd shelf from the bottom, with practiced certainty, the motion of someone who has rehearsed it, and her fingers found what they were looking for. A small key flat and old, taped to the wood with a piece of masking tape gone yellow with age. She peeled it free. She turned toward the center of the room. Against the opposite wall, on a low table between 2 mismatched chairs, sat a small wooden box. Walnut by the look of it, about the size of a shoebox, but shorter, with a brass latch and a keyhole that the family had assumed was decorative, or whose contents they had never thought to question, because the box had simply always been there, the way certain things in a family home simply always exist without ever being examined. Margaret walked toward it. "Stop!" Daniel's voice cracked the silence like a dropped plate. "You don't get to touch Dad's things after what you did." The room held its breath. Margaret stopped walking. She looked at her brother. She looked at him with eyes that had seen 18 years of something the rest of them hadn't. And when she spoke, she said only this: "I promised him this box wouldn't be opened until today." She set the key on the table beside the box and stepped back. No one moved. Gerald Marsh cleared his throat gently from his chair by the window, and the sound of it brought everyone back to themselves, like cold water. This is where the story truly begins. Not at the funeral, not at the moment Margaret walked through the door. It begins 18 years earlier, in a house that looked exactly like this one, with a family that believed it knew everything, and a father who understood that the truth delivered too soon can destroy the very people it is meant to protect. To understand what was inside that box, you first have to understand what everyone in that room believed to be true. The Calloway family had a story. Families always do. They build their shared mythology from the moments that hurt the most, polishing them smooth with repetition until the story becomes solid, unquestionable, the bedrock beneath everything else. Their story went like this. 18 years ago in the early weeks of November, Margaret Calloway, then 33, recently separated from her husband, working part-time at a nonprofit while she got back on her feet, had come to their father's home office late on a Wednesday evening. She had a key to the house. She had always had a key. No one had thought anything of it until the next morning, when Richard Calloway walked into his office and found that certain financial documents were missing. A folder, some papers, and a small wooden box that had sat on his credenza for years. Richard said almost nothing. His wife Eleanor was in the hospital at that point, 6 weeks into a treatment protocol that was costing more than anyone discussed in front of the children. The family was drawn taut with worry, and Richard was barely sleeping. But what Richard did say in the quiet, devastated way of a man who has been caught entirely off guard by something he cannot explain was that Margaret had taken something that was not hers to take. He did not elaborate. He did not accuse her in a courtroom way. There was no police report, no formal confrontation, no screaming match where she could have defended herself. There was only Richard's grief-soaked silence and the fact that Margaret stopped coming to family gatherings, and then stopped returning calls, and then, as far as the rest of them were concerned, simply ceased to exist as a member of the family. Daniel told the story one way. Margaret had stolen financial documents to use against their father in some scheme she had been planning since her separation from her husband. He was not specific about the scheme, but his conviction was absolute. Their younger sister Caroline told it differently. She believed Margaret had taken the box itself, that it contained something valuable, something their father had been saving, and that Margaret had grown desperate after her marriage fell apart and had made a terrible decision in a terrible moment. The youngest sibling, Thomas, who had been only 15 at the time and had understood very little of what was happening, had constructed his version from fragments overheard through walls and half-finished sentences at dinner tables. His version was the vaguest and, perhaps, the saddest. He simply believed that Margaret had done something unforgivable to their father, and that was why she had disappeared. And that was why their father had never spoken her name without a weight to it that silenced the room. What all three versions shared was the belief that Richard Calloway had spent the last 18 years of his life grieving his eldest daughter's betrayal, and so when Margaret walked into that house on the afternoon of his funeral, she walked into a room full of people who had built an entire architecture of grief around her absence, who had missed her at every birthday and wedding, and Christmas morning, and hospital waiting room, and graveside gathering, and who had comforted themselves through all of it with the story that she had earned her exclusion. That story was about to be dismantled, slowly, carefully, piece by piece, exactly the way Richard Calloway had planned. Margaret did not open the box immediately. That was the first thing that surprised them. Instead, she sat down in one of the chairs near the center of the room, folded her hands in her lap, and said, in the measured tone of someone reciting instructions they have memorized over years, that before anything else, she needed to read them 3 letters. Daniel was on his feet again before she finished the sentence. This is a manipulation tactic. She shows up here. She makes a production out of that box. And now she wants to read us letters. Dad has been in the ground for 5 hours. Mr. Calloway. Gerald Marsh spoke from his chair. He had a voice made for courtrooms quiet and absolute. I need to inform you all that I have a copy of your father's instructions in my briefcase. They were drawn up and notarized 9 years ago and updated twice since then. What your sister is describing is not improvised. It is the legally documented procedure your father specified for the reading of his estate. The room went very still. He wrote instructions for this, Caroline asked. He wrote extensive instructions for this. Gerald confirmed. including the letters your sister is referring to, which have been in my possession in sealed envelopes for the past 4 years." Gerald opened his briefcase. He removed 3 envelopes, cream-colored, sealed in the old-fashioned way with wax. He set them on the coffee table between the family. Each one bore a name in Richard Calloway's handwriting. Daniel, Caroline, Thomas. No one moved to take them. Margaret watched her siblings look at their own names written in their dead father's hand, and something moved across her face. Then not satisfaction, not grief exactly, but the particular expression of a person who has been carrying something enormous for a very long time, and can finally sense the weight beginning to shift. "He wrote to each of you," she said. "He asked that you read them before I opened the box, that's all." Thomas, the youngest, reached for his envelope first. He was 33 now, the age Margaret had been when all of this began. His hands were not entirely steady. The letters were long. The reading took nearly 20 minutes, and it was silent except for the occasional sound of paper being carefully turned. Gerald Marsh looked out the window. Margaret sat with her hands folded and looked at nothing in particular, and anyone watching her closely would have noticed that she did not look at her siblings' faces while they read. She gave them that privacy. Whatever those letters contained, they were private between a father and his children, words that had waited years to be received. What can be said is that when Daniel finally set his letter down on his knee, he did not look angry. He looked like a man who has just been told gently and irrefutably that he has misunderstood something fundamental and who is not yet certain what to do with that information. Why would he protect her legally? Caroline said not really to anyone. If she'd done what we thought she did, it was a question the family had not allowed itself to ask before. And it was the first crack. Go back 18 years. Back to the house, to November, to the particular kind of cold that settles into a family home when someone inside it is very ill, and everyone is pretending not to be afraid. Eleanor Calloway had been diagnosed the previous spring. The treatment was aggressive and experimental and expensive in the way that experimental treatments always are, meaning the costs were partially covered, and partially not, meaning the family finances were being managed with a precision and attention that Richard bore entirely alone, because Eleanor had asked him to, because she did not want her children to carry that weight while they were still young. And Richard, who had spent his entire adult life taking Eleanor's requests seriously, had agreed. He had not counted on what he would find. It was a Thursday morning in early November, nearly 18 years ago to the day. Richard had come into his home office before sunrise, the way he often did when worry kept him awake, intending to review the family's financial records. His younger brother, William, always helpful. William always available. William, who had managed the family business accounts for nearly a decade, on the grounds that he was good with numbers, and Richard was good with people, and they made a fine team, had dropped off a folder of documents the previous evening. Richard opened the folder. He sat with it for a long time. What he found there would not be repeated in detail here, because the specifics were the province of accountants and attorneys, and because the emotional truth was simpler and more devastating than any set of numbers. William Calloway, the youngest uncle, the man who had comforted the family through every crisis for years, had been quietly and systematically draining financial accounts that were not his, to drain transferring assets into structures that obscured his involvement, rewriting the paperwork of the family's modest wealth with the patient expertise of someone who had planned this for a long time. Richard sat in his office in the dark and understood several things simultaneously. He understood that his brother had done this. He understood that Eleanor was in the hospital and that the treatment keeping her alive was dependent on financial stability he was not certain he still had. He understood that if he moved against William, immediately exposed everything involved attorneys and investigators, the resulting chaos would be public and prolonged and would almost certainly reach Eleanor, would terrify her, might affect her treatment, might, in the worst version of events, kill her. And he understood that he needed time. What he needed specifically was someone he trusted completely, someone outside the immediate household, someone who could hold certain documents in safekeeping without William knowing they were gone. Documents that would become the foundation of whatever action Richard took once Eleanor was safe, once the treatment was finished, once the family was on solid ground. He called Margaret. She came that night. He told her everything. She sat across from her father in that office and listened to him lay out the situation with the methodical composure of a man who has spent his professional life making clear decisions under difficult circumstances. And when he finished, she said immediately and without hesitation, no. She would not do it. She would not carry something this large in secret. She would not become a vessel for the family's darkest information, and then walk away. Her father looked at her. He was 62 years old. He was frightened in the way that genuinely strong people are frightening to watch when they are frightened, because it is so unfamiliar. And he said, I know what I'm asking. I know it isn't fair. But your mother is in that hospital, and I cannot protect her and expose your uncle at the same time. And you are the only one I trust to do this carefully. And I need you to say yes. Margaret said no again. He said, please. She looked at her father for a long time. Then she said yes. She packed the documents into the wooden box. She taped the key underneath the bookshelf where only she would know to find it. She put the box in her car. She drove away. What she did not know was that her youngest brother Thomas, who had been 15 and restless and unable to sleep, had looked out his bedroom window at the sound of a car in the driveway and had seen her. Had seen his older sister loading something into her trunk, had told no one for 2 days, and then, when the tension in the house became unbearable, and their father's grief seemed to fill every room, had told Daniel what he'd seen, and the misunderstanding had taken root. Richard could have corrected it. He chose not to. Not because he was careless. Because he knew that if the truth came out while Eleanor was still sick, William would know the documents were missing, would know Richard had found him, and would make things very difficult very quickly for a family that could not afford any more difficulty. So Richard let his children believe what they believed. And Margaret kept her promise. His name was William Calloway, and for nearly 2 decades he had been the most beloved person in the family. He was 69 years old now, with a careful haircut, and the kind of easy warmth that people remember long after a conversation has ended. He had attended the funeral that morning, wearing a beautifully tailored dark suit, and had cried in a way that seemed entirely genuine. He had held Daniel's shoulder at the graveside. He had pressed a handkerchief into Caroline's hand. He had crouched down to speak quietly with Thomas, in the way that an uncle does, when he wants you to know he understands. He sat now in the living room of the Calloway home, slightly to one side, a cup of coffee balanced on his knee, watching the scene unfold with the careful attention of someone trying to assess a situation whose parameters are still unclear to them. He had not known about the box. He had assumed the documents were gone, had assumed that whatever Richard had or had not discovered all those years ago had died with him, that whatever Margaret had taken that night was beyond recovery, because Margaret had vanished from the family entirely, and vanished. People take things with them. He watched Margaret sit down and ask to read letters. He watched Gerald Marsh open his briefcase. He kept his expression exactly as it had been all morning, compassionate, patient, slightly grieving. He was very good at this. He had been very good at this for a very long time. Inside, something had begun to move with a slow, terrible certainty. The way ice sounds when it begins to crack under weight, that low, resonant sound you hear a fraction of a second before everything gives way. Margaret's marriage had ended in the 2nd year of her silence. His name had been Aaron, and he was a good man, a patient man, a man who had loved her with the straightforward earnestness of someone who had never been given a reason to be otherwise. When she told him she could not explain the estrangement from her family, not yet, maybe not for a long time, he tried. For 2 years, he tried. He sat with her in the evenings when the holidays came and went without invitation. He watched her put Christmas gifts in boxes and address them to siblings who did not acknowledge they had arrived. He held her hand at her mother's funeral, which they attended from the parking lot of a church, because Margaret had received through a mutual family friend the message that her presence at the service would make things harder for everyone. Aaron held her hand in that parking lot. He asked once more that night for some version of the truth, some fragment, something he could hold on to. She shook her head. She had made a promise. He filed for divorce 4 months later. Not angrily. Sadly. The way people end things they never wanted to end, but cannot find a reason to sustain. She signed the papers alone in her apartment. She did not tell her father. She did not tell her father about the job she lost in the 3rd year either, when the emotional strain had finally worn through the professional competence she had maintained by sheer willpower. Did not tell him when she moved to a smaller apartment, or when she spent 6 months in a therapist's office, learning how to live inside a life that felt like it had been borrowed from someone else and might need to be returned at any moment. She sent her nieces and nephews birthday gifts every year, cards for Christmas, little packages chosen with care because she knew their ages, their interests, the things they had mentioned to mutual acquaintances through the years, because she had kept track quietly from a distance, the way you keep track of people who do not know they are being loved. The gifts came back every year, unopened, sometimes with a handwritten note from Daniel that said in various formulations, the same thing, "We don't want this." She kept sending them. She had made a promise that required her to carry the family's hatred for the length of time her father needed. She had not been told that length of time would be 18 years. She had assumed it would be months, maybe 2 years, while Eleanor's treatment concluded, while Richard rebuilt the family finances, while he found the right moment and the right attorney and the right way to expose what William had done. But Eleanor's treatment ran long, and then Eleanor recovered partially and relapsed and recovered again, and throughout it all, Richard could not bring himself to shatter whatever fragile piece the family had built around his wife's illness. And then Eleanor died, and Richard's grief was the kind that unmoors people from their plans, and time kept moving, and Margaret kept waiting. She waited 18 years, and then she got the call from Gerald Marsh, telling her that Richard was gone. The letters had been read. The room had shifted. Not dramatically. The Callaways were not a dramatic family in the obvious ways, but the quality of the silence was different now. The kind of silence that follows significant information rather than precedes confrontation. Margaret picked up the key from the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at her siblings and she said, "I'm going to open it now. And I want you to understand that everything in here has been verified by Gerald, and there's additional documentation in his briefcase. Dad was thorough. He was always thorough." She put the key in the lock. She turned it. The latch released with a small click that in the quiet of the room sounded enormous. Inside the box, arranged with the careful order of a man who had spent a lifetime sorting things that mattered, were the following: a bundle of handwritten journals, small ones the kind you can fit in a coat pocket rubber banded together. Certified financial records, official looking with legal seals and notarized signatures on the top pages. Property deeds. A folder of old family photographs, the kind that predate digital cameras, soft-edged and warm-toned. A thick envelope of medical bills with Eleanor's name printed at the top. Individual sealed envelopes, one for each sibling, different from the ones Gerald had provided. These were smaller, personal, written in Richard's hand over the years. And at the very bottom, a single sealed envelope, marked simply, "Confession." Margaret did not touch the confession envelope. She set it on the table in front of Gerald Marsh. Then she took the bundle of journals and set them beside it, and the certified financial records and the property deeds, and she stepped back and said, "Gerald will explain the financial documents. But before he does, I think Dad wanted you to read his journals. The ones from the years right after I left." Daniel was the one who reached for the journals. Caroline leaned over to read beside him. Thomas stayed where he was in the chair against the wall, holding his father's letter in both hands, and he did not look up. Gerald Marsh opened his briefcase again and removed a second set of documents, his own copies, official and complete, and laid them carefully on the coffee table. "What you're looking at," Gerald said, "is a documented pattern of financial misappropriation extending over approximately 14 years. Your father discovered the initial evidence 18 years ago. He began assembling documentation 9 years later, once your mother's health was stable enough that he felt the family could withstand the disruption. Over the following 9 years with my assistance, he built a case thorough enough to survive any legal challenge. He paused. The individual responsible has been present in this room today. Nobody moved for a moment. Then slowly, as if the entire room had decided something without speaking, every head turned toward the corner where William Calloway sat. He had set down his coffee cup very precisely on the arm of his chair. His expression was the same as it had been all morning, composed, warm, slightly grieving. But his hands, if you looked at his hands, were absolutely still in the way that hands are still, when a person is concentrating very hard on keeping them that way. William denied it, of course. He did so calmly, in the practiced voice of a man who has spent years managing perceptions, who understood that the first move in any confrontation of this kind is to question the evidence before examining it, to introduce doubt before the facts have time to settle. These are Richard's documents, he said carefully. Richard was not well in his final years. I think we all know that. He became suspicious of things that... These are certified, Gerald interrupted quietly. Independently audited, signed by 3 separate financial investigators over a period of 7 years. He turned one of the documents on the coffee table so that it faced the room. The signatures on these transfer documents, Mr. Calloway, are yours. Notarized, dated. Several of these transactions occurred on dates when you were the sole signatory on the relevant accounts. I manage those accounts. Richard asked me to manage them. Of course, my signature is on documents. The transfers went to accounts in your name, Gerald said. Accounts that your brother had no knowledge of. The documentation includes the account numbers, the banking institutions, and the statements showing the funds received. That's not. There are also witness statements. Gerald removed another envelope from his briefcase. Your brother was not the only person who noticed things over the years. He was simply the only one in a position to do something about it quietly. William looked at the room. He looked at Daniel, who had set the journals down and was staring at him with an expression that had passed through shock and arrived somewhere much colder. He looked at Caroline, whose face had gone completely still. He looked at Thomas, who had finally looked up from his father's letter and was watching his uncle with the expression of someone revising a very long history, very quickly. He looked at Margaret last. Margaret was not looking at him with anger. She was looking at him with something closer to exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that comes not from a single terrible moment, but from years of carrying the weight of someone else's choices. William's composure held for another 20 seconds. Then something in it gave way. Not dramatically. Not violently. There was no raised voice. No table swept clean with one arm. No theatrical collapse. He simply put his face in his hands. And when he looked up again, his expression had changed in the fundamental way that a lie changes when it finally stops working. It didn't become honest so much as it became empty. I needed money, he said. It came out flat. I had debts, the kind you don't talk about. I told myself I'd replace it. I kept telling myself that. For 14 years, Daniel said. I know. William looked at the floor. I know how long it was. The room sat with that for a moment. Then Caroline said, Dad knew. He knew, and he protected us from knowing while Mom was sick. She looked at the certified documents on the table. She looked at the stack of journals. He spent years building a case, and he never... She stopped. Her voice had gone thin. He never let us know what he was carrying. He had help, Thomas said quietly. Everyone looked at Margaret. She was looking at the empty box. The silence that followed William's admission was long and complicated. The kind of silence that contains multitudes. Grief, relief, anger, and something else. Something harder to name. The particular emotion of realizing that the story you have lived inside for years was built on a missing piece, and that the missing piece changes everything. Daniel was the first to speak. He stood up from his chair. He walked across the room to where Margaret sat, and he stopped in front of her. and the expression on his face was the expression of a 47-year-old man doing something he had not done since he was a child. He was genuinely uncertain. Uncertain of himself. Uncertain of what he was allowed to ask for. "I called you a thief," he said. "At Mom's funeral, I stood in that parking lot." "I know," Margaret said. "I said things." He stopped. His jaw worked. "I said things that—" "Daniel." He stopped. "I know," she said again. What she meant, and what everyone in the room understood she meant, was not that it was all right. Not yet, perhaps. Not for a long time. But that she had held this long, and she could hold a little longer, while the family found its way to words. Daniel sat down on the arm of the nearest chair, heavily, like a man from whom something structural has been removed. Caroline's apology came differently. She crossed to Margaret and sat beside her on the small sofa, and took her sister's hand and held it without speaking. And the pressure of that grip said everything Caroline was not yet capable of saying out loud. Thomas was the one who cried. He was the youngest, the most recently an adult, and perhaps he had less practice at not crying. Or perhaps he had the least complicated grief, because his memory of the original events was the thinnest, and therefore the revision cost him less than it cost the others. He sat in his chair against the wall and put his hands over his eyes and cried quietly for several minutes. And no one said anything, because there was nothing to say. Margaret sat in the center of all of it. She had imagined this moment 1,000 times over 18 years. She had constructed versions of it in her mind during long nights in her smaller apartment during the years of therapy. During every Christmas morning, she had spent alone with a cup of tea and her father's voice on the phone, which was all she had been permitted, which was the concession she had asked for, when the weight became almost more than she could manage. "Just your voice," she had told him once. "Just let me hear your voice sometimes." He had called her every 2 weeks for 18 years. They had talked about ordinary things. The weather, a book he was reading, a bird that had taken up residence in the backyard. He had never acknowledged the situation directly on those calls, because he was afraid of the phones, afraid of being overheard, afraid of anything that might dislodge the careful architecture of delay he had built. But sometimes, at the end before hanging up, he said, "I know what I asked of you." And she said, "I know, Dad. It was enough, and it was not enough, and she had survived on it anyway." She had not imagined that the moment of resolution would feel like this. She had thought it might feel like victory or vindication or some version of relief so large it had a physical weight. Instead, it felt quiet. It felt like the particular silence after a very long sound has finally stopped when your ears are still ringing and the world is adjusting to the absence. Gerald Marsh spoke carefully about the estate. There was more than the family had known, significantly more, because the financial documents in the box included assets William had believed were beyond recovery accounts he had not known, about a long-term arrangement Richard had made with a financial advisor he had never mentioned to anyone in the family. The estate was enough to be meaningful. Divided between the 4 Calloway children, it represented security the kind their father had spent his life building, and his brother had spent 14 years quietly dismantling. Gerald asked Margaret about her share. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wanted less than her equal share. Every sibling looked at her. "I want enough to be comfortable," she said. "I have what I need. I've been careful." She paused. "What I actually want, what I'd like if everyone agrees, is to use part of the estate to restore this house. The whole thing. The roof, the foundation, the kitchen, everything Dad kept putting off because the money was never quite there." She looked around the room. "And then I want it kept in the family, not sold, not rented, a place where everyone can come, every generation, for as long as we can manage it." There was a silence. Then Daniel said, "Dad suggested that, didn't he?" "In his letter to me," Margaret confirmed. He said he thought it was the only inheritance that would last. Daniel looked at the sealed confession envelope still sitting on the coffee table in front of Gerald Marsh. No one had opened it. "What's in that one?" Caroline asked. Gerald glanced at Margaret. She nodded. He broke the seal. He read it silently first, then looked up at the family. "Your father asks that I read this aloud," he said. He settled his reading glasses on his nose. What Richard Calloway had written in that final letter was not long. He was a man who believed in saying things directly when the time for indirection had passed. He wrote that he had made a decision 18 years ago that cost one of his children everything, and that he had made it because he believed protecting the family required someone willing to sacrifice for it, and that he had chosen Margaret not because she was the strongest of his children, though she was, but because she was the one who would keep the promise. And he had known that from the time she was 17 years old. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote it directly, not the way people apologize when they are trying to minimize the apology, not wrapped in qualifications and context. Simply, "I am sorry for what I asked you to carry. I am sorry for the years. I am sorry for Aaron. I am sorry for the holidays and the funerals and the birthdays and the gifts that came back unopened. I am sorry for every moment of it. I believed it was necessary, and I would like to be wrong about that. But I am no longer alive to be corrected." He wrote, "You kept your promise, and in doing so, you kept this family safe in the one moment it could not afford to be otherwise. That is not a small thing. I hope someday they understand what it cost." He wrote, "If you are all reading this together, then it has worked, and I am grateful, and I hope you will forgive each other, because that is the hardest part, and it is the only part that matters." Gerald Marsh folded the letter. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the November light was failing early, the way it does in the Northeast, turning the yard and the bare trees and the old stone path to the mailbox, that same particular shade of gray gold that belongs only to late autumn, late afternoons, and which every person who has ever stood in that yard in November carries somewhere behind the eyes for the rest of their lives. Margaret sat with her hands in her lap, and her eyes were dry now, though they had not been a little while before, and her expression was the expression of someone who has reached the end of a very long road and is not yet certain what the landscape looks like from here. Her brother Thomas came and sat beside her on the small sofa. He did not say anything. He simply put his arm around her. She let him. The months that followed were slow, the way real repair always is. The restoration of the house took most of the following year. There were contractors and permits and decisions about whether the kitchen should be updated or simply fixed, and whether the garden should be replanted or left to recover on its own. And all of these were decisions that the Calloway siblings made together, across phone calls and occasional Saturday afternoons in the yard, with coffee and measuring tape, and the specific gentle arguments of people who have not yet learned each other's habits again, but are practicing. The legal matter involving William was handled formally and without drama. He cooperated in the end, which made things somewhat simpler, without making them easier. The family did not attend those proceedings as a group. Some things are not reconciled. They are simply resolved. Margaret moved closer, not back to the town, but closer, a 40-minute drive instead of 4 hours. She found a small house with a garden that needed attention and spent her first spring there learning how to grow things, which she found she was good at in the patient, methodical way. She'd always been good at things that required consistent attention over time. She and Aaron did not reconcile. That would have been a different story. But they had coffee once, 2 years after the box was opened, and the conversation was ordinary and kind, the way conversations between people who once loved each other can be ordinary and kind when enough time has passed. and neither person is still carrying a secret. Her nieces and nephews were the easiest. Children, even adolescent ones, have a directness that their parents lose over time. They wanted to know their aunt. They asked her questions without subtext. They showed her things, a project, a playlist, a funny video on their phones, and expected her to be interested, which she was genuinely and without effort, because she had spent 18 years being interested in them from a distance. And now she got to be interested up close. The gifts she sent were no longer returned. The house hosted its first Thanksgiving together in nearly 2 decades on a Thursday in late November, the year after Richard's funeral. There were 22 people. Children, grandchildren, a couple of in-laws who had only ever known this family by its fracture, and who were quietly, privately amazed to find themselves inside something that felt unexpectedly like wholeness. Margaret arrived first and lit the candles on the dining room table that had held 12 people comfortably, and was now extended to its full length with a folding table added at one end and a tablecloth that didn't quite match, which no one mentioned. On the bookshelf in the living room, the small walnut box sat empty. It sat the way objects sit when they have been released from their purpose, lighter somehow, or seeming lighter, no longer weighted by what they contained. Its lid was open. There was nothing inside except the faint smell of old paper and the brass of the latch catching the afternoon light. Margaret stood in front of it for a moment before the others arrived. She did not touch it. She looked at it the way you look at something that has cost you a great deal and is now finished costing you. And you are trying to decide whether it is possible to feel something clean about it yet. Whether enough time has passed to find the years useful in some way, the way a scar can become a kind of map, the way loss can become a kind of knowledge. She was still deciding when she heard the front door open, and voices and the particular organized chaos of children arriving with their coats and their opinions, and their requests for which television they would be allowed to turn on before dinner. And she turned away from the box and went to help in the kitchen. The wooden box stayed on the shelf, no longer hiding anything, only there, the way certain objects in a family home are simply always there to remind anyone who looked at it long enough that secrets have a weight and silence has a cost, and the person who seems from the outside to be the one who broke everything is sometimes the very one holding the pieces together at great expense in the dark where no one can see, that some promises take years to keep, that some debts are paid not in money, but in time, in birthdays, in a marriage, in a parking lot outside a church, where you listen to hymns through a car window and hold yourself very still and remind yourself why you said yes. And that sometimes, not always, but sometimes the family that comes out the other side of that kind of silence is something rarer and more durable than the one that went in, because it has learned what it costs to keep it.